The hospital hallway. The harsh fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast their usual pale glow across the sterile corridors, where the faint scent of disinfectant always lingered in the air, like a reminder that pain and healing lived side by side here. Every step David Jackson took echoed off the polished tiles, carrying with it the weight of years of exhaustion, loneliness, and unshakable responsibility. At just 36 years old, David looked closer to 50. The deep creases carved into his forehead told the story of sleepless nights, of bills stacked higher than his hope, of prayers whispered in silence when no one else could hear. His shoulders carried the strength of a construction worker, but even steel eventually bends under enough pressure. In his arms lay the only reason he still fought, the reason he woke up every morning despite the gnawing despair that threatened to hollow him out, his 3-year-old son, Mason. Dressed in his favorite Superman pajamas, the bright blue fabric and bold red S across his tiny chest stood in almost cruel contrast to his fragile body. Mason's cheeks burned with fever, his little lips chapped and dry, yet his eyes, large, innocent, endlessly curious, still shimmered with the stubborn light of childhood wonder. He looked up at his father with trust so complete it nearly broke David's already weary heart. "Daddy," Mason whispered, his voice hoarse, a trembling smile tugging at his lips. "Will the doctor make me feel better this time?" David shifted his son carefully, mindful of the IV line taped to Mason's small hand. He forced a smile, though his throat tightened around the words. "Yes, my brave boy, the doctors here are very good. They'll make you strong again, I promise." It wasn't the first promise David had made to his son, and each time it cut deeper, because he wasn't sure how many more times he could keep making them. For 6 long months, Mason's rare blood disorder had turned their lives into a battle with no rest, no end in sight. Every week brought new bills, new medications, new complications. David had drained what little savings he had. Long ago, his construction job, already uncertain and seasonal, became nearly impossible to manage when Mason needed hospital visits that lasted days at a time. His foreman had been sympathetic at first, but sympathy faded quickly when deadlines slipped. Now David lived from odd jobs, late-night side work, and the grace of hospital social workers who kept his boy's treatments just barely within reach. The thought haunted him every night. What happens if one day I can't pay? What happens when the medicine stops? He pushed it down, burying the fear beneath sheer willpower, because Mason didn't need a broken man. He needed a father who would never stop fighting. As David moved down the corridor, the murmur of voices drifted from a glass-walled conference room nearby. Inside, men and women in expensive suits sat around a long mahogany table, their postures sharp, their eyes fixed on glowing financial charts projected across the wall. They looked untouchable, creatures of a world far above his own, a world of numbers and profits where illness was a statistic rather than a nightmare that kept you awake at night. David's jaw clenched as he passed, feeling the sting of resentment. To them, people like him were invisible, his son nothing more than another entry on an insurance ledger. "Daddy, look." Mason suddenly stirred in his arms, his fever bright, eyes widening as he pointed toward the conference room. David slowed, frowning, puzzled by his son's sudden excitement. "What is it, buddy?" The boy pressed his small hand against the glass, his voice rising with certainty. "That's Mommy, that's Mommy." The words slammed into David like a blow. For a moment, he thought Mason must be delirious, the fever making him dream. His chest constricted painfully as his gaze followed the boy's finger. At the head of the table stood a young woman in a crisp white business suit, her golden hair pulled neatly into a bun, her poise radiating confidence and authority. She spoke with commanding gestures, her presence filling the room. To everyone, around her she was a leader, a force of power and success. But to David she was something else entirely. His breath caught, his stomach twisted into knots. He knew that face, had memorized it once upon a time, in the days when her laughter filled his small apartment, when her touch had been his comfort, when her promises of forever had still felt unbreakable. Emily Mitchell. 2 years. 2 years, since she had vanished without a word, leaving him with a 1-year-old child and the crushing silence of betrayal. 2 years of raising Mason alone, wondering how the woman he once loved so deeply could walk away from both him and their son. She had left for ambition, for the world of wealth and power she had always chased. She had never called, never written, never even asked if Mason was alive or well. David's jaw tightened. No, Mason, he thought, his heart aching. That can't be your mommy anymore, not after what she did. Yet before he could respond, before he could pull Mason away from the glass, the woman's gaze turned toward the hallway. For just an instant her words faltered, her expression slipped. Her blue eyes locked on David's, then fell to Mason in his arms. And in that frozen moment, time collapsed on itself. Her face drained of color. The confident mask of a CEO cracked, revealing something raw and human beneath. She excused herself abruptly from the meeting, her chair scraping against the floor as she strode to the door with urgent steps. The room behind her erupted in whispers, but she heard none of it. David's breath came shallow. His legs felt rooted in place, as if the very ground beneath him had hardened to stone. Mason, unaware of the storm brewing in his father's chest, stretched his arms eagerly as the door opened. "Mommy, Mommy, I knew it was you," he cried, his little voice ringing through the corridor. Emily stopped just a few steps away, her eyes trembling as tears welled. She hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. The life she had buried, the choices she had made, suddenly standing before her in the form of a boy she had once cradled, a man she had once sworn to love. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. David stood stiff, his arms tightening around Mason instinctively. Anger, grief, longing, all of it crashed over him in waves. He wanted to scream at her, to demand answers, to shield his son from the confusion that would follow. Yet Mason's tiny hands reached for her, his innocence cutting through the years of bitterness. The hallway seemed to close in around them. Every shadow, every fluorescent flicker bore witness to the reunion of a broken family. And though neither David nor Emily spoke another word, the silence itself carried everything. The betrayal, the regret, the hope, the fear. Behind the conference room glass, eyes watched curiously, none more intent than Thomas Anderson, the CFO of Mitchell International Health Group. He studied the scene with a calculating smirk. To him, this wasn't a tragedy or a reunion. It was an opportunity. A powerful CEO exposed, vulnerable, entangled with a man and child who didn't belong in her polished world. His mind was already working, plotting how to twist this moment into her downfall. But David didn't see Thomas, didn't care about the stares from strangers. All he saw was Emily, back from the dead, standing just feet away, trembling as Mason called to her with pure, unquestioning love. And in that moment, David knew one thing with painful certainty. The past they had both tried to bury was no longer gone. It was alive, raw, and demanding to be faced. The confrontation. The sterile air of the hospital seemed to grow heavier as Emily Mitchell stood only a few feet away from the family she had abandoned. For years, she had crafted an identity that glittered in the public eye. CEO of Mitchell, International Health Group, celebrated innovator, a woman admired for her iron will and impossible rise to power. Yet in that very moment, under the fluorescent lights of St. Mary's, none of her wealth, none of her authority, none of her carefully built reputation mattered. What mattered was the boy stretching out his arms to her and the man staring at her as if she were both a ghost and a wound reopened. "Mommy, Mommy, I knew it was you." Mason cried again, his little voice echoing down the hall, cutting into every layer of silence that stood between his parents. Emily's knees trembled. Her chest tightened as though an iron band was crushing her lungs. She wanted to run forward, to sweep him into her arms, to bury her face in his curls and beg his forgiveness. But David's grip tightened protectively around the child, holding him back like a wall of stone. His jaw clenched, eyes cold, his body rigid with rage and heartbreak. "You don't get to call yourself that," David said at last, his voice low, steady, and trembling with years of restrained fury. His words hit like blades, deliberate and sharp, Not after everything. Not after 2 years of silence. Emily flinched as if struck. The strength she wore in boardrooms, the confidence that made men twice her age shrink under her authority, crumbled before the raw truth in his voice. She took a small step closer, her heels clicking faintly against the tile. But David shifted back instantly, shielding Mason from her touch. "David, please," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I don't deserve his forgiveness, I don't even deserve yours, but let me hold him just once. Mason wriggled against his father's arms, his small hands stretching toward her desperately. His fever-flushed face lit up with joy in a way David hadn't seen in months. "Daddy, please. I want Mommy." The sound of that word, so innocent, so full of belief, pierced through David's armor. His entire body shook with conflict. He had fought for years to protect his son from the shadow of abandonment, to be both father and mother, to never let Mason feel the absence that had crushed him. But to deny him now, when the child was looking at the woman with hope, not pain, felt like betrayal of a different kind. Slowly, with trembling hands, David loosened his grip. His heart screamed in protest, but his son's longing screamed louder. He lowered Mason gently to the floor, and in an instant the boy stumbled forward, collapsing into Emily's arms. Emily dropped to her knees, clutching Mason so tightly she feared she might break him. Tears burst from her eyes, streaming down her cheeks in uncontrollable waves. She kissed his forehead again and again, sobbing into his hair, whispering his name like a prayer she had long abandoned. "Mason, my sweet boy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Mason clung to her without hesitation, his small fingers twisting into her blouse, his cheek pressed against her chest. He didn't care about the years she had been gone, the nights of illness and pain she had missed. In his world, Mommy was here. Mommy was real, and that was enough. David's fists clenched at his sides as he watched the scene unfold. The anger in him boiled, his chest tight with bitterness, yet his heart cracked under the sight of his son's happiness. He wanted to tear Mason away again, to scream at Emily that she didn't deserve this, that she couldn't just reappear and take what she had abandoned. But Mason's soft whimper of relief, the way his small body melted against her as though he had finally found the missing piece of himself. It was a sound David couldn't erase. Emily looked up at him through her tears, her voice trembling. "David, I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed everything, but please don't take him from me. Please don't take this chance away. I want to be in his life again. I can't change the past, but I want to try. I need to try." David's eyes blazed. He stepped closer, his voice a hiss of barely controlled fury. "Try? Now you want to try? Where were you when he burned with fever at 2 a.m. and I couldn't afford the ambulance? Where were you when I sat in this same hallway praying the doctor would come out with good news? Where were you when I lost job after job because I couldn't leave him alone? You don't get to say you want to try now. You left. You left us both to drown." Each word landed like a hammer, and Emily bowed her head under the weight of them. She knew there was no excuse. She had convinced herself years ago that leaving was the right choice, that she wasn't ready for motherhood, that David would somehow do better without her weakness. But the truth was, she had been selfish, chasing the glitter of ambition, while telling herself lies that soothed her guilt. "I was a coward," she admitted, her voice breaking as tears streamed freely down her face. "I was terrified. I thought I would ruin him, ruin you if I stayed. I told myself if I left you would both be better off. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." David laughed bitterly, shaking his head. The sound was hollow, like glass breaking. "Better off? You think we were better off with silence? Do you know how many nights he asked about you? Do you know how many times I had to lie, tell him Mommy loved him but couldn't be here, while I wanted to scream the truth that you had chosen the world over your own child?" Emily sobbed harder, her hand tightening around Mason as if the child's warmth could keep her from collapsing completely. Mason, oblivious to the storm of adult pain swirling above him, simply nestled deeper into her embrace, whispering, "Mommy, Don't go away again. Those words struck David like a spear. His son's innocent plea was the very thing he had feared most, that Mason would cling to her again, only to be broken a second time when she disappeared. He couldn't let that happen. Not again. Behind the glass, the conference room buzzed with whispers. Curious executives watched the powerful CEO kneel in the hallway, undone by a child and a man who clearly didn't belong in their world. But none watched more intently than Thomas Anderson. His lips curled into a quiet smile as he discreetly raised his phone and snapped photos through the glass. To him, this was gold, evidence of vulnerability, of scandal. Emily Mitchell, the iron-willed leader, crumbling in public in the arms of a man from the other side of the tracks. Thomas had waited years for a crack in her armor, and now he had found it. Emily didn't notice. She didn't see the calculating eyes or the flashing camera. All she saw was the son she had abandoned, the man whose love she had thrown away, and the fragile bridge of hope that trembled between them. David's voice cut through her thoughts, cold and hard. You don't get to just walk back in because you feel guilty. Mason isn't a choice you pick up and drop when it suits you. If you want to be in his life, prove it. Not with words, not with tears, prove it. Emily looked up, her eyes red, her breath shaky. She wanted to promise, wanted to swear she would never leave again. But David's gaze warned her that empty promises would only break what little trust remained. For the first time in years, the powerful CEO felt powerless. She could buy anything in the world, except her son's trust, except the forgiveness of the man who had carried all the weight. She had dropped. In the heavy silence that followed, Mason lifted his small face, looking between them. His eyes, wide and full of innocent hope, held none of the bitterness, none of the history. Only longing. Only love. Mommy, he asked softly, his voice like a bell in the quiet corridor. Are you going to stay this time? The question hung in the air, heavier than anything David could have said, sharper than any accusation he could have hurled. Emily's heart stopped. She could feel her son's little hand on her chest, the warmth of his trust, the weight of his hope. It was a question she had no right to answer, but one she could not run from anymore. David's jaw tightened, his eyes boring into hers. You heard him, he said quietly, his voice carrying both warning and plea. If you say yes, then you'd better mean it, because breaking him again would be the cruelest thing you could ever do. Emily's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, but her throat locked, choked by fear, regret, and the crushing weight of her son's innocent belief. She could only nod faintly, clutching Mason tighter, her tears soaking into his hair. And in that moment, as the hallway grew silent once more, the lives of all three of them shifted irreversibly. The reunion was not a resolution, it was a spark, igniting a storm that none of them could yet see. The promise. The days that followed that unexpected reunion at St. Mary's unfolded like a dream. David wasn't sure he wanted to wake from, or maybe more like a nightmare where hope and fear blurred together, impossible to separate. Emily hadn't vanished. She hadn't walked away again. Instead, she returned each morning, walking through those sterile hospital doors not as the untouchable CEO the newspapers loved to praise, but as a trembling mother rediscovering what it meant to kneel at her child's bedside. David didn't know what to make of it. Part of him expected her to leave after the first night, convinced that the weight of the hospital corridors and the sight of Mason's suffering would send her fleeing back into her glittering world of polished boardrooms and headlines. But she came back. Every day. She sat with Mason through the long hours of treatments, brought him books and toys, brushed the sweat from his forehead when his fever rose, and in the quiet moments when Mason's eyes finally closed in sleep, David caught glimpses of a woman stripped of all her armor. Her hands trembled, her eyes red from sleeplessness, her face lined with the same raw fear he had lived with for years. Emily had always seemed untouchable to the world, a woman who commanded respect and built empires with nothing but willpower. Yet here, beside her son, she was fragile, broken in ways no one could see. And David, though his anger still burned, could not deny the truth in front of him. She loved Mason. That love had never died, no matter how deeply she had buried it beneath her ambition. Still, the scars of abandonment ran deep. Every time, Emily reached for Mason's hand. David's chest tightened with the memory of nights when he had sat alone, clutching that same small hand while Mason burned with fever. Every time she whispered promises of never leaving again, his mind hurled back at him the sound of silence. Silence when she never called, never checked in, never cared enough to ask if their son had survived another day. He wanted to believe her. For Mason's sake, he wanted to. But belief felt like stepping off a cliff with no net to catch him. Emily seemed to understand. Perhaps that was why she didn't rely on words this time. She relied on action. Within 48 hours of her return, Mitchell International Health Group's vast resources began to mobilize. For months, David had fought to secure specialists, to scrape together enough money for treatments that barely scratched the surface of Mason's condition. Now, suddenly, doors that had once been slammed shut flew open. The nation's top pediatric hematologists were summoned to St. Mary's, flown in at Emily's command. Cutting-edge treatments, experimental therapies still hidden from the public eye, were made available as if Mason were the only patient on Earth. Paperwork that once took weeks was processed in hours. The cramped, outdated room where Mason had endured so much pain was transformed into a private suite filled with state-of-the-art equipment. David resisted at first. His pride fought against the sudden flood of privilege. He had built his life around sacrifice, around surviving with nothing, and to accept her help felt like admitting defeat. He argued with her in hushed tones late into the night, his jaw tight, his voice sharp. "You don't get to walk in and fix everything with money, Emily. You don't get to buy back the years you lost." Emily's reply was quiet but firm, her eyes steady on his. "I'm not trying to buy anything, David. I know I can't undo the past, but I can do this. Let me fight for him now, with you. Not instead of you, with you." The conviction in her voice shook him more than he wanted to admit. Because beneath the CEO's authority, beneath the reputation and wealth, there was something raw and real, something that looked like the woman he had once loved. For Mason, the transformation was immediate. He adored the attention, the books Emily read to him, the toys she brought, the way she sang softly at night when David's voice grew hoarse. He clung to her with the innocence only a child could carry, his small heart unburdened by the history his father couldn't let go of. To Mason, Mommy was back, and that was all that mattered. But for David, every moment was a battle between hope and doubt. He watched Emily closely, searching for cracks, for signs that her promises were just another performance. And though he found none, the shadows of the past still whispered in his ear. Far above them, in the gleaming towers of Mitchell International's headquarters, another battle brewed. Thomas Anderson, the CFO, sat in his office with the photos he had taken through the hospital glass. He studied them with a predator's eye, his lips curling into a smile. Emily Mitchell, reduced to tears, clinging to a black man's child in the hallway of a public hospital, scandal written in every pixel. To him, it wasn't just about her vulnerability. It was about image, perception, and power. And Thomas had always believed Emily's meteoric rise had stolen the power he deserved. Now he had the weapon he needed. Whispers spread through the board of directors. Leaked photos, quiet suggestions of inappropriate relationships, murmurs of instability. Thomas fanned the flames carefully, never openly accusing but planting seeds of doubt in men already resentful of being outrun by a younger woman. Soon Emily would find her position under threat, not from her rivals outside the company but from the very people who sat across the boardroom table. She didn't know it yet. For now, her focus was entirely on Mason. One night, after Mason had finally fallen asleep, Emily sat in the corner of his hospital suite, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles whitened. David sat on the other side of the room, his posture weary, his eyes shadowed with suspicion. "David, she said softly, breaking the silence. I know nothing I do will erase what I've done. I know you may never forgive me, but I need you to believe one thing: I love him. I never stopped. Not for a second. Every day I was gone, I thought of him. Every night I wondered if he was safe. And I was too much of a coward to come back, afraid you'd slam the door in my face. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please let me be his mother again. Let me prove it. David's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the sleeping boy between them. He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to shut her out forever, to protect the fragile world he had built from the woman who had once destroyed it. But Mason's small body, curled under the blankets, whispered a truth louder than his anger. His son needed her. Not the CEO, not the millionaire. The mother. You don't get to prove it with promises, David said at last, his voice quiet, almost broken. You prove it by staying day after day, night after night. No more words, no more disappearances. If you walk away again, if you hurt him again, I won't let you back. Ever. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her voice firm with a resolve that surprised even her. Then I'll stay. No matter what it costs me, I'll stay. And for the first time in years, David saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not ambition, not pride, not the hunger for more, but something humbler, something that looked very much like truth. Still, he told himself, time would be the only test. The storm for a fleeting moment. The hospital room felt almost like home. The steady hum of machines became a lullaby. The warm lamplight softened the sterile walls, and Mason's laughter filled the air with a joy David thought he'd never hear again. Emily sat at the foot of his bed, reading from one of the picture books she had brought, her voice carrying a tenderness that no boardroom had ever heard. Mason clapped his little hands, his cheeks glowing with a color David hadn't seen in months. But peace, David had learned long ago, was a fragile thing. And in their case, it was borrowed time. Miles away, in the glass towers of Mitchell International, Thomas Anderson tightened his net. He had spent decades clawing his way up the corporate ladder, only to watch Emily Mitchell eclipse him with youth, brilliance, and daring moves that the press adored. She had made him irrelevant, a relic in a world moving too fast. But now he had something she couldn't control: perception. The photos he had taken in the hospital hallway circulated quietly among select board members, each image accompanied by whispers. A CEO entangled with a construction worker? A sick child hidden from the public eye? How could she lead a global empire when her personal life was in shambles? Some dismissed it at first. Emily's track record was too strong, her results undeniable. But doubts, once planted, grew roots, and Thomas watered them daily with well-timed conversations, carefully chosen words, and subtle threats about reputation, risk. By the end of the week, the board demanded an emergency meeting. Emily sat stiffly at the head of the long mahogany table, her golden hair pulled back, her white suit flawless as always. But beneath the polished image, her mind raced with the weight of Mason's treatments and David's searing words that still echoed in her chest. She hadn't told David about the board's suspicions. He had enough battles of his own. But the storm Thomas had unleashed loomed larger with each passing hour. Thomas rose smoothly from his seat, his expression the very image of professionalism, though his eyes glimmered with something cruel. Colleagues, he began, sliding a folder across the table. It pains me to raise this matter, but it is my duty to protect the integrity of our company. Recent revelations have come to my attention that cast doubt on Ms. Mitchell's ability to continue leading us effectively. He clicked a remote and the photos flashed across the screen. Emily in the hospital hallway clutching Mason with tears streaking her face. David standing nearby, his work clothes rumpled, his expression one of fury. To the board, the images were scandal, weakness, distraction. Gasps rippled across the room, whispers rising like a tide. This, Thomas continued smoothly, is not the image of strength and stability our shareholders expect. We are a global health leader, yet our CEO appears to be embroiled in personal complications that compromise her judgment. I propose we consider interim leadership while Ms. Mitchell addresses her private affairs. Emily's chest tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had faced harder men than Thomas before. But this was different. This time the battle wasn't just for her company. It was for Mason, for the fragile chance of redemption she had barely begun to grasp. "I will not step down," Emily said firmly, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Yes, that boy is my son. Yes, I made mistakes, grave ones. But don't confuse vulnerability with weakness. That child is fighting for his life, and if any of you had the courage to sit where I sit, you'd understand that true leadership isn't about hiding behind walls of glass. It's about standing in the storm and refusing to break." Her words silenced the room for a moment, but Thomas leaned forward, his smirk barely hidden. "Stirring speech, Emily. But words won't reassure shareholders. Perception will. And right now, perception is not in your favor." The meeting ended in uneasy silence, the board divided, Emily's position shaken. As she left the room, her phone buzzed with a message from David. Mason's fever spiked. "They're rushing him into the ICU. Her heels echoed like gunshots as she sprinted down the hospital corridors minutes later, her heart pounding violently against her ribs. She burst into the ICU to find David already there, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched Mason's small fingers. The boy's body shivered under blankets, his skin hot to the touch, machines beeping frantically around him. "What happened?" Emily gasped, rushing to the bedside. "The infection spread faster than they thought," David said, his voice ragged. "They're trying a new treatment, but—" His throat closed, his words breaking into silence. Emily's knees buckled. She reached for Mason's hand, tears spilling uncontrollably. "Stay with me, baby, please stay." Hours blurred into days. The ICU became their entire world. David pacing relentlessly, Emily refusing to leave Mason's side. Doctors and nurses rushing in and out with updates that brought little comfort. The mighty CEO, once feared in boardrooms, now knelt beside her child's bed, whispering lullabies through cracked lips. Her once perfect hair a tangled mess, her makeup washed away by tears. David watched her, his heart twisted in ways he didn't understand. Part of him still hated her, hated the years she had stolen, the nights of loneliness, the weight she had abandoned on his shoulders. But as he saw her sitting sleepless by Mason's bed, saw the raw desperation in her eyes, he realized this wasn't the Emily who had left. This was a woman stripped of pride, stripped of power, clinging to her son with every ounce of strength she had left. Late one night, when the machines hummed softly and Mason finally slept in fragile peace, David sat across from her in the dim light. His voice was low, heavy with weariness. "Why now, Emily? Why after all this time? Why come back when it's almost too late?" Emily looked up, her eyes swollen from crying, her hands clasped tightly around Mason's small fingers. "Because I couldn't stay away anymore. I tried to convince myself I was doing what was best for you both, but I was lying. To you, to him, to myself. I thought ambition would fill the emptiness. It didn't. It only made it worse. Every night I saw his face in my dreams. Every morning I hated myself for not being here. And when I saw you in that hallway, I knew I had wasted too much already. I'm not asking for forgiveness, David. I'm asking for a chance to stand here, with you, for him." Her voice cracked and she lowered her head, her tears falling silently onto Mason's blanket. David stared at her for a long time, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He wanted to stay angry. Anger was safe. Anger protected him from the pain of remembering what it felt like to love her. But looking at her now, broken and raw, he saw something else. Sincerity. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his bitterness falter under the possibility of hope. Before he could speak, Mason stirred in his sleep, whispering faintly, "Mommy, Daddy, don't leave." The words pierced both of them, binding them together in a way no argument could undo. And as they sat there side by side in the dim glow of the ICU, Neither realized that outside those walls, the storm Thomas had unleashed was reaching its peak. The board was already preparing to force Emily out. Shareholders whispered of scandal. The press circled like vultures, but none of that mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the fragile rise and fall of Mason's chest, the small heartbeat that tethered them together, and the unspoken truth that whether they wanted it or not, their fates were bound once more. The family's choice. The ICU room smelled faintly of antiseptic and hope. For days the machines had been the only sound David trusted. The rise and fall of steady beeps, the hum of oxygen, the faint hiss of medication dripping into fragile veins. Mason's fever had raged, pushing both parents to the edge of despair. But slowly, carefully, like dawn breaking after a long storm, his tiny body began to fight back. His fever broke, his breathing steadied, and when his eyelids fluttered open revealing those wide, innocent eyes, David felt his knees go weak. "Daddy," Mason whispered hoarsely, his small lips curling into a tired smile. "You stayed." David pressed his forehead against his son's, tears burning his eyes. "Always, buddy. Always." Beside him, Emily wept openly, her hands shaking as she cupped Mason's cheeks. "And Mommy's here too, sweetheart. I'm not leaving, not ever again." It was a promise spoken through tears, but this time it wasn't empty. David could see it in her face. She wasn't the Emily who had walked away 2 years ago. She was someone changed, burned raw by regret, humbled by motherhood, and stripped of the illusions that once drove her. Still, outside the sanctuary of the hospital, the storm raged on. Thomas's campaign had reached its climax. Headlines swirled with speculation about Emily Mitchell's secret family, her reckless entanglement, and whispers that she was unfit to lead. The board prepared a vote to strip her of power. Investors fretted about image and reputation. For the empire Emily had built, the walls were closing in, but in the quiet of the ICU, she no longer seemed to care. One evening, when Mason finally slept peacefully, David sat across from Emily in the dim light. His arms folded, his expression weary, but his eyes softer than before. "You know what's happening out there, don't you?" Emily nodded slowly. "Thomas won't stop until he takes everything from me. The board is already circling. By next week, they'll force me out." David studied her, his voice low. "And what will you do? Fight them? Run back into the fire just to prove you can win again?" For the first time since he had known her, Emily's shoulders slumped, her proud posture collapsing into something more human. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I don't care about winning anymore. Not if it costs me him. I've spent years building an empire, chasing every accolade, every headline, and in the end, it gave me nothing but emptiness. But when I sit here holding him, I feel something I haven't felt in years. I feel alive. I feel home. If they want the company, they can have it. I won't lose Mason again. Not for all the power in the world." The words struck David deeply. For so long, he had seen Emily as someone who valued ambition above all else. To hear her renounce it, to see her choose family over empire, shook the bitterness lodged in his chest. But pain was not so easily erased. He leaned forward, his voice heavy with years of wounds. "Do you have any idea what you're asking, Emily? For 2 years I carried everything alone. Every sleepless night, every doctor's bill, every moment when I thought I might lose him. And you weren't there. Forgiveness doesn't come easy. It's not something you earn in a week or a month. If you want a place in his life, if you want a place in mine, you'll have to prove every single day that you mean what you say." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't shy away. She reached across the bed, her trembling hand brushing against David's. "Then I'll prove it. Not with promises, not with speeches, with actions. If it takes the rest of my life, I'll show you I've changed." For a long moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitor. Then Mason stirred, his small voice rising sleepily. "Mommy? Daddy? Can we all go home together?" The innocence of the question shattered what little wall remained between them. David closed his eyes, a deep sigh escaping him. And when he opened them again, he looked at Emily, not with the bitterness of the past, but with the fragile beginnings of something else, something like forgiveness. Days later, when Emily walked into the boardroom for what she knew would be her last time as CEO, she no longer wore the armor of ambition. She wore something greater: peace. The board members whispered, some smug, others uneasy, as Thomas presented his final case against her. But when they called for her response, Emily stood tall and calm. "I built this company with everything I had. I fought for it, bled for it, sacrificed for it. But I made a mistake. I thought success meant leaving my family behind. I was wrong. Success means nothing if you lose the people you love. So take the title, take the company. I won't fight you, because my son needs a mother more than the world needs another CEO." Gasps rippled through the room. Thomas smirked, thinking he had won. But what he didn't realize was that in that moment, Emily had taken away the one weapon he had, her vulnerability. By choosing family openly, she stripped scandal of its sting. Headlines the next day didn't read "CEO falls in shame." They read, "Millionaire mother chooses family over fortune." What Thomas had meant as her downfall became her redemption in the public eye. And as Emily walked out of that boardroom for the last time, David and Mason waited for her in the lobby. Mason ran into her arms, his laughter echoing across the marble floor. David stood nearby, his arms crossed, his expression still guarded. But when Emily looked at him, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a sign that the walls between them were beginning to crack. Weeks later, when Mason was finally discharged, the three of them stepped out of St. Mary's together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Emily held Mason's hand in one of hers, David's in the other. For the first time in years, they weren't fragments of a broken past. They were the fragile beginning of something new. It wouldn't be easy. The wounds were deep, the road uncertain. But as Mason swung their hands and laughed, his voice pure and free, David realized something he had almost forgotten: hope. Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with quiet determination. "This time, David, I'm staying, no matter what." And for once, David believed her. Together, under the fading light, they walked forward, not as a perfect family, but as a family willing to fight for each other. And that, David realized, was worth more than all the riches, all the power, all the empires in the world.